With the South Dakota Comprehensive Property Tax Legislative Task Force working to address property tax issues in the state, one local volunteer fire department wants to ensure the task force doesn't make a change that impacts the financing systems for the departments and EMS tax districts. Today, members of the Whispering Pines Volunteer Fire Department presented a letter of support to the Pennington County Commission. The letter asked the task force to not reform property taxes at the expense of fire and ambulance services. The president of the board of directors for Whispering Pines says sometimes when dealing with a big bill and everything moving so fast, it may be hard to think of all the possible consequences. He adds he wanted to make sure the task force keeps his department and other ones in mind when crafting a bill that doesn't remove the funding sources they have now.
The costs of, say, buying a fire truck or buying firefighting equipment are going up more than 3% a year. The number of volunteers that we can attract has slowly been going down.
Anderson says he's been supportive of the crafting of a tax system that gives relief to homeowners while not hurting the ability of first responder districts to provide services. The Pennington County Commission motioned to move the agenda item to September 16th to have time to review some of the wording in the letter.